Welcome to Grassroots History. This channel explores the forgotten stories, hidden figures, ancient uses, political battles, and cultural moments that have shaped our world. Today, we are diving into one of the most misunderstood chapters in human history. When we think of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, we think of gold, silver, and the conquest of vast territories. We think of steel swords and religious fervor. But there was another resource, humbler than gold, but far more vital to the survival of the empire, that the Spanish carried across the sea in their heavy wooden hulls. It was a plant that would eventually sprout across the Americas, changing the course of history in ways the Spanish crown never could have predicted. This is the story of how Spain accidentally changed cannabis history forever. To understand this journey, we have to look past the modern stigmas and political debates. In the age of exploration, this plant wasn't a controversy. It was a cornerstone of civilization. It was the fiber that bound the world together. Without it, the New World might never have been reached. In the 1500s, if you wanted to rule the waves, you had to grow hemp. It is impossible to overstate the strategic importance of times cannabis sativa times to a maritime superpower like Spain. A single Spanish galleon, the massive multi-decked sailing ships that carried the riches of the Americas, required an astronomical amount of hemp. We are talking about nearly 80 tons of hemp fiber per vessel. This wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. Hemp was the only fiber strong enough to withstand the brutal tension of Atlantic gales, and resistant enough to saltwater rot to keep a ship afloat for months at a time. If the ropes snapped or the sails tore, the empire died at sea. Therefore, for the Spanish monarchs, hemp was as critical as gunpowder. But there was a problem. Spain's own soil wasn't always the most hospitable for large-scale hemp cultivation, and they often found themselves relying on expensive imports from the Baltic regions or Russia. As the Spanish expanded their reach into the Americas, the crown realized they couldn't just keep shipping tons of rope across the ocean. They needed to produce it on-site. They needed the New World to become a self-sustaining factory for the sinews of their fleet. And so, the seeds of a global transformation were packed into wooden crates and loaded onto ships destined for the unknown. The official entry of cannabis into the Western Hemisphere wasn't a clandestine affair. It was a government mandate. In 1545, under the direction of the conquistador Pedro de Valdivia, the Spanish began the first intentional cultivation of hemp in the New World, specifically in the Quillota Valley, near what is now Santiago, Chile. But this wasn't just a local experiment. The Spanish crown was obsessed with hemp production. They issued royal decrees times cedulas reales times ordering colonial governors to ensure that hemp was planted alongside essential food crops. In some regions, it was even legal for landholders to pay their taxes to the crown in hemp fiber instead of gold or silver. This was green gold in its most literal sense. The goal was simple: create a colonial supply chain. The Spanish established cordage works or rope factories in cities like Lima and Havana. They wanted to build and repair their ships using American-grown fiber. However, nature had its own plans. The Spanish were master navigators, but they didn't fully understand the biological plasticity of the plant they were carrying. As times cannabis sativa times moved from the temperate climates of Europe to the tropical and high-altitude environments of the Americas, the plant began to change. This is where the story takes an accidental turn. The Spanish brought hemp for its fiber, the stalks. They wanted the long, tough cellulose strands to make rope, but times cannabis sativa times is a highly adaptive species. In the intense sunlight and heat of the equatorial and subtropical colonies, the plants began to produce more resin. This resin, filled with cannabinoids, was the plant's natural defense against UV radiation and dehydration. While the Spanish officials were focused on the length of the stalks, the people actually working the land, the indigenous populations, and the enslaved Africans brought to the colonies started to notice other properties of the plant. To the Spanish elite, the failure of some colonial hemp to produce high-quality fiber was a disappointment. They found that in certain hot climates, the stalks became too brittle or too short for the best rope. What the Spanish saw as a failed crop, the local population saw as a new discovery. The plant that had been brought for the great ships began to find its way into the local medicine cabinets and spiritual practices. The Spanish had inadvertently introduced a potent botanical agent into a landscape filled with people who had thousands of years of experience in herbalism and shamanism. The industrial plant was becoming a cultural plant, right under the noses of the colonial administrators. We cannot talk about the history of hemp in the Americas without acknowledging the harsh reality of the labor that produced it. Hemp cultivation is backbreaking work. It requires intensive harvesting, soaking the stalks in water, a process called retting, and then beating the stalks to separate the fiber. This labor was largely performed by the oppressed classes of the colonial system. For the enslaved and the colonized, the hemp fields were a site of forced labor, but they also became a place of secret knowledge. Because the Spanish were so focused on the fiber for their ships, they often ignored what the workers did with the leaves and the flowers. In the shadow of the empire's demands, a subculture began to form. The plant became a tool of survival used for its seeds as a source of protein, its fiber for local textiles, and its resinous flowers for relief from the physical and psychological toll of colonial life. As the 16th century bled into the 17th, this accidental legacy of the Spanish Empire began to spread. From the ports of Mexico to the mountains of Peru, the seeds were moving. The Spanish had intended to build a maritime wall of rope and canvas to protect their interests. Instead, they had planted the seeds of a botanical revolution that would eventually slip out of their control and take on a life of its own. But as the Spanish influence began to wane and other empires, the British and the French, entered the fray, the role of this plant would shift once again. The industrial necessity was about to meet a new era of political upheaval and social change. How did this humble fiber plant go from being a royal requirement to a feared devil's weed? And what happened when the British colonies in the north took the Spanish obsession with hemp and turned it into an economic weapon of their own? In the next part of our series, we travel north to the 13 colonies, where the demand for hemp would reach a fever pitch, leading to laws that actually forced farmers to grow it, and eventually setting the stage for a conflict that would change the world. If you found this deep dive into the hidden roots of history fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Grassroots History. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you don't miss part 2, where we'll explore how hemp fueled the American Revolution and the strange reasons it eventually fell from grace. What do you think? Was the Spanish introduction of cannabis the most significant botanical event in the Americas? Let us know in the comments below. While the Spanish were inadvertently scattering cannabis seeds across the southern reaches of the continent, a different kind of urgency was brewing in the north. To understand why hemp became the backbone of the American colonies, we have to look at the ocean. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Empire was a maritime superpower, but its strength was tethered to a very fragile supply chain. A single British ship of the line, the massive warships that enforced the king's will, required an astronomical amount of hemp. We're talking about over 60 tons of hemp fiber for the rigging and sails alone. The ropes had to be strong enough to withstand Atlantic gales, and the canvas sails had to be durable enough to catch the trade winds without tearing. At the time, Britain was dangerously dependent on Russia for this industrial gold. The British Crown realized that if the Tsar ever cut off the supply, the Royal Navy would rot at its moorings. The solution? The New World. The colonies weren't just a place for religious freedom or gold hunting. They were intended to be a massive overseas hemp farm. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a strategic necessity. In 1619, at the very first meeting of the House of Burgesses in Jamestown, the first cannabis law in American history was passed. It didn't ban the plant. It required every farmer to grow it. Hemp was so vital to the survival of the colonies and the security of the empire that failing to grow it could result in fines or even jail time. This was the birth of the American hemp boom, not driven by choice, but by the cold, hard requirements of imperial warfare. As the 1600s bled into the 1700s, a strange economic phenomenon occurred. In the colonies, hard money, gold and silver, was incredibly scarce. Most of it flowed back to England to pay for manufactured goods. This left the colonists with a problem. How do you run an economy without cash? The answer lay in the fields. Because hemp was so universally needed and had a fixed value to the British Navy, it became legal tender. In Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, you could literally pay your taxes with bundles of hemp. You could buy a horse with hemp. You could settle a debt at the local tavern with hemp. But growing it was back-breaking work. Unlike tobacco, which was a delicate boutique crop, hemp was an industrial beast. It grew 10 to 15 feet tall in a single season, choking out weeds and exhausting the soil. The process of turning that tall stalk into usable fiber was a nightmare of manual labor. Farmers had to ret the hemp, soaking it in ponds, or leaving it in the dew to rot away the outer bark. Then came the brake, a heavy wooden device used to smash the stalks and separate the fiber. It was violent, dusty, and exhausting work. This leads us to one of the darker, often overlooked chapters of this history. The boom of the hemp industry was inextricably linked to the system of slavery. In states like Kentucky, which would later become the hemp capital of the world, the grueling labor of the hemp breaks was almost entirely forced upon enslaved Africans. The accidental history of cannabis in America is, unfortunately, deeply intertwined with the history of human bondage. By the mid-1700s, hemp had moved from a forced colonial chore to a passion project for the American elite. Men like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson weren't just politicians, they were scientific farmers, obsessed with making the colonies self-sufficient. Washington's diaries are filled with references to his hemp crops at Mount Vernon. He frequently wrote about sowing hemp and pulling the floral hemp, showing a sophisticated understanding of the plant's biology. He was particularly interested in finding the best varieties for high-quality rope. Jefferson, ever the tinkerer, even invented a new type of hemp brake and went to great lengths to smuggle high-quality hemp seeds from Europe and Asia, risking imprisonment because he believed the plant was of the first necessity to the young nation. There is a popular legend that the Declaration of Independence was written on hemp paper. While the final parchment we see in the National Archives is animal skin, the Times drafts times the messy, revolutionary ideas of Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson were almost certainly captured on hemp rags. In this era, hemp wasn't a controversial drug. It was the literal paper of revolution, the clothing of the Continental Army, and the cordage of the privateers who harassed the British Navy. So, how did we get from grow it or go to jail to the modern era of prohibition? The shift began in the 19th century with two major developments. First, the Industrial Revolution brought the cotton gin and steam power. Cotton became much cheaper to process than hemp, and steamships didn't need miles of rope or acres of canvas. Hemp's strategic dominance began to wane. Second, the accidental legacy of the Spanish, the psychoactive side of the plant, finally met the industrial side of the British. As the 1800s progressed, medicinal extracts of cannabis began appearing in American pharmacies. For a few decades, you could buy cannabis tinctures as easily as aspirin, but as the 20th century approached, political and racial tensions began to boil. The plant that had built the Royal Navy and funded the American Revolution was suddenly rebranded. It was no longer hemp, the industrial savior. It was marijuana, a dangerous foreign menace. Sensationalist media and corporate interests, fearing hemp's potential to compete with the burgeoning synthetic fiber and paper industries, launched a campaign of misinformation that would eventually lead to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. History is rarely a straight line. It is a series of accidents, mandates, and hidden motives. The Spanish brought the plant for God and gold, never realizing they were seeding a cultural revolution. The British forced its growth for war, never realizing they were fueling the very independence of their colonies. Today, as we see a resurgence in industrial hemp and a global shift in cannabis policy, we aren't really seeing something new. We are seeing the return of a plant that has been at the center of the American story since the very first day. From the decks of the Spanish galleons to the diaries of George Washington, the history of cannabis is the history of us, complex, controversial, and deeply rooted in the soil of the New World. Thank you for joining us for this two-part journey into the hidden history of hemp and the Spanish accident that changed everything. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit the like button, share this video with a history buff, and subscribe to Grassroots History for more stories from the forgotten corners of our past. What other hidden histories would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep digging for the truth.